Every successful investor pitch begins with a misunderstanding that must be unlearned. Founders often believe they are pitching a product, a market, or a set of numbers. But investors know better. They are not buying what exists today. They are buying a version of the future, and their confidence depends on whether the founder can make that future feel coherent, believable, and worth the risk. In the quiet rooms where funding decisions are made, data is abundant. What is scarce is clarity. Investors listen not for brilliance, but for alignment. Does the story hang together? Does the problem feel real? Does the solution feel inevitable? Does the founder understand what could go wrong? Books on venture capital reveal a consistent truth. Most pitches fail not because the opportunity is bad, but because the story is fragmented. At its core, an investor pitch is an act of compression. Years of work, months of doubt, thousands of decisions, all distilled into minutes. This compression is not about simplification for its own sake. It is about signal extraction. What matters? What doesn't? What must be understood emotionally before it can be understood intellectually? The founders who raise capital are those who can answer these questions under pressure. Every compelling pitch begins with tension, not excitement, tension. A friction in the world that is persistent, costly, and unresolved. Investors hear countless problems, but only a few feel structurally broken. Storytelling forces founders to confront this honestly. Who exactly is struggling? Why now? Why does this problem endure despite existing solutions? When founders skip this tension, the pitch floats. When they anchor it, attention sharpens. Another insight echoed across fundraising literature is that investors think in trajectories, not snapshots. A pitch is not judged on where the company is, but on how fast and cleanly it is moving. Early revenue matters less than rate of learning. Early traction matters less than repeatability. The story must show motion, not hype, but momentum driven by cause and effect. Investors are looking for evidence that progress is not accidental. Founders often overestimate the role of novelty. They assume investors are searching for unprecedented ideas. In reality, investors are searching for better execution in changing conditions. Many billion-dollar companies were not first, they were timely. Books show that the strongest pitches position the startup at an inflection point. A new technology, a regulatory shift, a behavioral change. The story feels powerful when it aligns the company with forces larger than itself. The role of the founder is central, but often misunderstood. Investors are not funding charisma. They are funding judgment. How founders speak about mistakes reveals more than how they speak about success. A pitch that includes learning signals adaptability. One that avoids weakness signals fragility. The most trusted founders do not pretend to have all the answers. They demonstrate they know which questions matter. Numbers, of course, matter. But numbers without narrative are inert. Metrics only become meaningful when they explain why something is happening, why churn dropped, why margins improved, why growth slowed. Books on pitching emphasize that investors listen for understanding behind the metrics. Do you know which levers matter? Do you know which assumptions are fragile? Storytelling turns metrics into evidence of competence rather than decoration. Another theme that emerges strongly is coherence. A strong pitch feels internally consistent. The problem matches the solution. The solution matches the business model. The business model matches the market. When any of these elements are misaligned, investors sense it immediately, even if they cannot articulate why. Story is what creates alignment. It allows complex systems to be grasped intuitively. Timing also shapes whether a story lands. A pitch delivered too early feels speculative. Too late feels incremental. The books show that successful fundraising often happens at moments of transition, when a constraint breaks, when demand shifts, when proof crosses a threshold. The pitch captures a company mid-motion, not at rest. Investors fund momentum because momentum reduces uncertainty. Another overlooked aspect of investor storytelling is audience specificity. Not every story is for every investor. Funds have theses, time horizons, risk appetites. The strongest founders tailor the narrative without distorting the truth. They understand that resonance matters more than volume. A pitch that deeply connects with one investor is worth more than a pitch that vaguely interests many. As pitches evolve, storytelling also becomes a mirror for the founder. Preparing to raise capital forces clarity. It exposes weak assumptions. It surfaces strategic confusion. Many books note that even unsuccessful fundraising rounds often strengthen companies because the narrative work sharpens thinking. The pitch is not just a tool for investors, it is a discipline for founders. And this is where the story begins to narrow. Because once founders realize that funding is not won by persuasion but by visibility, by helping the right investors see the future clearly, the pitch transforms. It becomes less about convincing and more about alignment, less about performance and more about truth. At this stage, storytelling stops being something added on top of the business and becomes the lens through which the business is understood, communicated, and built, tightening with each iteration until the narrative feels inevitable rather than optimistic, unfolding with calm precision, like a well-drawn map that makes an unfamiliar territory feel navigable rather than intimidating. And this is where an investor pitch either transforms into a funding catalyst or quietly fades into the background noise of good ideas poorly communicated. In the second half of the pitching journey, storytelling shifts from structure to signal. At this stage, investors are no longer asking whether the story makes sense. They are asking whether it holds under pressure. They probe assumptions. They test edges. They introduce doubt not to intimidate, but to see how the narrative responds when stressed. Books on successful fundraising emphasize that this moment reveals everything. A strong story flexes without breaking. A weak one collapses into defensiveness or abstraction. One of the most decisive factors here is how founders handle uncertainty. Investors do not expect certainty, they expect awareness. When a founder openly acknowledges what they do not know, while clearly explaining how they intend to learn, confidence increases. This seems counterintuitive, but the literature is consistent. Credibility is built through realism, not bravado. A pitch that pretends risk does not exist feels dishonest. A pitch that names risk and frames it intelligently feels investable. Another critical element that surfaces is narrative ownership. Great founders do not outsource their story to slides. They inhabit it. Their words sound lived in, not rehearsed. They can zoom in and zoom out seamlessly, moving from granular details to strategic vision without losing coherence. Investors notice this immediately. It signals mastery, not mastery of presentation, but mastery of the business itself. As conversations deepen, the story also becomes a filter. Not every investor who likes the pitch should be a partner. Books on founder-investor relationships stress that alignment matters more than valuation. A story that lands funding but attracts misaligned capital often creates future friction. Smart founders use the pitch to repel as much as attract. They signal how they think, how they decide, and how they handle conflict. The right investors recognize themselves in that story. Another insight that emerges here is pacing. Many founders rush to close, fearing that attention will disappear if they slow down. But seasoned investors are not persuaded by urgency, they are persuaded by inevitability. A well-paced story allows space for questions, reflection, and follow-up. It respects the investor's process. The books show that funding decisions often crystallize after the meeting, when the story continues to make sense in silence. Follow-up communication becomes part of the narrative arc. Updates are not administrative, they are storytelling in motion. Each update either reinforces momentum or exposes inconsistency. Founders who communicate progress clearly, honestly, and rhythmically turn time into an ally. Investors begin to root for the story to continue. Funding becomes less of a leap and more of a step. Eventually, the most successful pitches reach a quiet inflection point. The conversation stops being about whether the startup deserves funding and starts being about how to structure participation. This is the signal that the story has landed, not because it dazzled, but because it aligned. The investor can now see themselves inside the narrative, contributing capital, guidance, and patience to a journey that feels coherent. This is the true conclusion the books arrive at. An investor pitch is not a performance, it is an invitation. An invitation to believe that a particular version of the future is plausible, worthwhile, and responsibly pursued by the people in the room. When the story is clear, honest, and well held, funding becomes a natural extension of shared conviction. If this reflection resonated with you, pause and ask yourself one question. If an investor repeated your pitch to a partner tomorrow, would the core story survive without you in the room? That answer tells you whether your narrative is strong enough yet. Share that insight. And if you want to continue refining how clarity, humility, and storytelling quietly outperform hype in fundraising, stay connected. Subscribe, follow, and return. Because the pitches that land funding are not the loudest, but the ones that make belief feel reasonable.